Right, let's talk about Rishi Sunak's smoking ban. It passed quite comfortably in its first reading in the House of Commons. So it could soon be the case that anyone born after 2008 will never be allowed to ever legally buy a tobacco product. The aim is to create a smoke-free England. Tom, what have you made of this?
Well, it's thoroughly depressing, but it was also... the writing's been on the wall for some time. I think it's fair to say. Not only was this policy had already been announced at Tory party conference to much fanfare, finally Rishi Sunak has had a vision for the country, and that was that young people will never be able to buy cigarettes, which is a strange kind of legacy. But I think it was also a reminder of how ineffectual sort of Tory opposition to nanny state feels like a bit of a weak term for this, but in this case, full-blown prohibition, really. But whilst there's always been a kind of a section of that party who will talk a good game on these matters, there's not enough of them. And even then, some of them, their kind of scruples disappear, actually, in the course of these votes and these actual debates. But there's so much about it. I mean, there's the fundamental kind of liberal point about the fact that as long as you're not harming anyone else, you should be able to do whatever you like. You should be able to consume what you like. The fact that that's completely evaporated is kind of cross-party consensus now that that's a ridiculous way to govern a country is thoroughly depressing. And it's not going to stop here either. This idea that it's just about smoking, I think, is ridiculous. But also it's just how stupid it is. I mean, the way they talk about these young people will never be able to buy cigarettes. Now, young people aren't really smoking anyway for reasons we might get into. But it's also the fact that they seem completely blind to the idea that there is this thing called the black market and that it might actually grow as a consequence of this. And the fact that every time you try to impose even just taxes and more petty restrictions on something like smoking, it's a boon to the bootleggers and always has been. So it's an absurd policy. I hope it will kind of collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. Like when you've got a situation where a 56-year-old is having to buy cigarettes for their 55-year-old neighbour because they haven't got the right identification, surely people will realise this is ridiculous. But at the same time, it's just it's the fact that what I thought was quite a fundamental principle of whatever you do is done as a government's business, so long as it doesn't harm anyone else, has just evaporated now. Yeah,
and Toby, I mean, we live in a time when we fetishise evidence-based policies. Surely one of the most important iron laws of politics is that prohibition doesn't work. I mean, we were kind of talking about this in the last section. We know that hate speech laws don't work, and they do it anyway. Technically, this is supposed to be a heroin-free country, a cocaine-free country. Yes. Why do they keep going? Why do they talk as if this is the end of cigarettes?
I know, it's odd, isn't it, when you think about how ineffective the marijuana ban has been. I mean, the ineffectiveness of the marijuana ban is often cited as a reason to, decriminalise marijuana use. And yet here they are trying the same thing with tobacco. It's so odd that Rishi decided to make this his kind of flagship die-in-a-ditch policy. I mean, there's so much that he could be trying to address, and he's chosen this to focus on. It's like it shows just how politically kind of tone deaf he is. This and making maths compulsory up to the age of 18.
Well, people suggest it's just his personal preferences, things that he likes.
It's like, if Labour are going to lower the voting age to 16, what can I do to make sure that they can look at the Conservative Party and take us seriously? I know, we'll make them do maths, until they're 18. That'll really make them vote for us. But just to take issue with something you said, Tom, you said that the kind of, J.S. Mill's principle that if an action is entirely self-regarding and doesn't pose any potential harm to anyone else, then why is the government legislating about it and trying to ban it? Isn't the argument, I think, a spurious one, but the argument is that smoking isn't entirely self-regarding, that it harms others in the form of secondhand smoke. We actually published some pieces in the Daily Sceptic by John Stadden, a professor of psychology emeritus at Dartmouth College in the US, who's actually wrote a book about secondhand smoke and the evidence that secondhand smoke actually does cause, respiratory diseases like lung cancer is so threadbare as to be, virtually non-existent. But that is the argument. And when people want to, ban various forms of speech and classify them as hate speech, the argument often is that allowing people to say, for instance, trans women aren't women, actually causes vulnerable communities harm, and we need to legislate to ban this in order to protect these vulnerable communities. It's always a spurious argument, but I suppose we can at least take some comfort from the fact that they are nevertheless trying to kind of make the argument in a way which is kind of compatible with Mill's harm principle.
They are, but I think that's always been spurious as well. I mean, even when the smoking ban came in 2007, the idea that this was about just protecting people and barmaids, etc., from secondhand smoke, that was proven wrong quite quickly when they also included things like, tradesmen couldn't smoke in their own vans, or you couldn't smoke on open train platforms and things like this. It was always about control rather than actually about trying to just kind of protect people. And especially at this point in time where, the days of people kind of smoking at their desk in the office or smoking at the cinema or smoking on the airplane, they're well and truly over. You know? And whether or not you want to take issue with those restrictions, the idea at this point in time, we need to go further and kind of ban smoking is so ridiculous. But I do wish that, because there is such a kind of cross-party consensus on this, and because of the fact that smoking has been declining. It's a relatively small portion of the population at this point. It's a quite acceptable prejudice to be against people who smoke, to be almost viscerally disgusted by it. Wes Streeting often gives vent to that particular prejudice. The fact that it's even that point, even to the point where the places in which people can smoke is so restricted, the fact that it's now pretty much your own house or outside or whatever, the fact that you are still not allowed to indulge this ghastly preference of yours in peace, I think does reflect a real shift in how we understand the balance between the individual and the state in this country. And I think also where smoking is concerned, it's always been tainted by snobbery. There's always been this kind of sense of the sort of people who smoke, and they should be protected from their own ghastly habits. And the fact that it's succeeded, I think, is a real blow to that England of just live and let live. It's just people haven't quite got to grips with that yet. And it's also definitely not going to stop at cigarettes.
Yeah, and it's become a cliche, but when did you last hear someone say, it's a free country?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't hear it anymore, do you?
But it's worth stressing that, the government is extending a lot of its sort of nanny state policies to things that are not even harmful to the individual. I mean, you think the ban on NOS, on laughing gas, a substance so harmful that they give it to pregnant women. The ban on vaping. Now, vaping is not, a health cure, but it's certainly nowhere near as bad as smoking. And, it answers, as you've made this point many times, Tom, it answers that question of, what would we do if someone would invent a cigarette that was not harmful, that came with none of the harms that people complain about. Well, we've done that, and they still don't want people to.
Which is part of this bill as well. They want to clamp down on. It's a little bit vague on the vape section, but it seems like a clamp down on flavours is in the offing, as well as taxes on vape juice and so on. And that's another reminder that this is just about control, really, at the end of the day. I mean, because of the fact that this has been presented as we need to stop kids smoking. Obviously, kids aren't allowed to smoke anyway, so that's a slightly. But the future generations from ever taking it up. Amongst young people, I think between 18 and 24-year-olds, the smoking rate is like halved over the course of the past 10 years. And a lot of that is down to vaping. And it's not proving to really be a gateway towards smoking. They're just kind of having that and stopping it. So the fact that not only are they kind of trying to create a problem where it isn't, young people are not taking up smoking in large numbers, and also simultaneously are clamping down on what, if you wanted to put it in public health terms, has been the best harm reduction invention ever in relation to smoking, I think tells you that this was always about Puritanism, really. It was just about, as Mencken put it, all of our leaders seem to be gripped by this paralysing fear that someone somewhere might be enjoying themselves in a way that they don't like. That seems to be what's going on. But just finally on Toby's point about the lack of vision that Rishi Sunak has, apart from on these really absurd, petty nanny state issues, I think there's a relationship between those two things. I think, even when New Labour got really into the politics of lifestyle, it was telling that they come into power, they make the Bank of England independent, they relinquish control over this huge area of economic life, and then suddenly they think, you know what we need to do? We need to seize power over the smoking policy of every pub in the land. It's almost like the more that politics shrinks, the more that the state wants to get more involved in your business. And also the less that a politician has any sense of vision for society, has any kind of ambition for what he can achieve in office, the more he just sees the kind of improvement of the public as more of his kind of jurisdiction. I think Sunak's a good example of that.
Maybe part of the explanation, Tom, is that any society has a kind of fixed quantity of things it wants to ban, police, prescribe. And as society loosens up in some respects, so as it becomes more sexually permissive, as it becomes more acceptable to engage in all kinds of sexual preferences, as it becomes more acceptable to change your gender and so forth, as we become much less kind of religious with respect to the policing of that whole dimension of our lives. So to compensate, because we can't cope with too much freedom, we have to start policing things like smoking in the home, what people can see on the internet. And you can see, actually, I think there does seem to be a pattern whereby the countries which have become the most authoritarian when it comes to the policing of language and speech, like Ireland, are countries which have only recently become kind of liberated from the kind of puritanical diktats of Catholicism. You see it in Brazil too. Brazil has suddenly become incredibly authoritarian about just these things, not about sex and gender. And it's as though the human psyche cannot cope with too much freedom. So if they become liberated in one area, they immediately have to become repressed in another.
Yeah. And certainly our leaders can't cope with us having too much freedom. So even if you've got it in some areas, they'll take it when the others are.
I think that's probably the bigger problem.